Chapter 23, Circulation. In Chapter 23, we're going to compare circulatory systems of different animals. We're going to spend the majority of our time talking about the human cardiovascular system and the main component of such system, the human heart. Next, we will talk about structure and function of blood vessels, and with a little bit of a look into the structure and functioning of blood. All right, circulatory systems. Well, what is the significance? What is the importance of a circulatory system? Well, besides sustaining life. But circulatory systems, their purpose is to facilitate the ability of cells to acquire nutrients, exchange gases, and to get rid of their waste products. So for most animals, not all, but most, circulatory systems are a facilitator to sustain life. It is for animals that have circulatory systems, a circulatory system is an internal transport system that brings resources, nutrients, and oxygen to cells, and at the same time take away the waste products, metabolic waste and carbon dioxide. Well, cnidarians and flatworms don't really have a circulatory system, but they have a gastrovascular cavity, which not only facilitates digestion, but also transport of materials to all parts of the body. And these are animals. Now, animals that have a very thick body, multiple layers of cells, that isn't going to work. They have to have somewhat of a true circulatory system that has a heart, number one, to pump a circulatory fluid, which is blood, and blood vessels to transport this fluid throughout the body. Now, with regards specifically to circulatory systems, we have two types, open and closed. Open circulatory systems we find in all arthropods, which includes insects and most, but not all, mollusks. They have a heart of sorts, but they have open-ended blood vessels. And the blood gets pumped out of these vessels into body cavities called hemocoels, and the fluid, which functions much like your blood. But also, there's no distinction with an open circulatory system. There is no distinction between blood and interstitial or tissue fluid. Animals with closed circulatory systems have that distinction. Closed circulatory systems are found in vertebrates, earthworms, squids, and octopi, and have a circulatory fluid blood that is confined within vessels and separate from interstitial fluid, which bathes the cells, but is outside of the blood vessels. In vertebrates, our circulatory system is called a cardiovascular system. It has three main types of blood vessels. Number one are arteries, which carry blood away from the heart to tissues and organs. Veins return blood from tissues and organs back to the heart, and capillaries, which carry the blood between the arteries and the veins. These are the actual sites of exchanges of gases, and nutrients, and waste products. All right, looking at circulatory systems, let's take a look at the circulatory system of a fish. A fish have a heart with two chambers, a two-chambered heart. Main chambers, atrium, which receives blood from the veins, and a ventricle, which pumps it through the arteries. And in the fish circulatory system, the heart pumps the blood to the gills, and then from the gills to the rest of the body. Arteries which branch into smaller arteries or arterioles, which give rise to capillaries. Capillaries make extensive capillary networks called capillary beds, and it's these beds of capillaries that infiltrate every organ and are near every cell. Now, capillaries will converge into venules, tiny little veins, which in turn converge into larger veins that return blood to the heart. Now, one of the things I want to talk to you about before we move on, we talked about surface to volume ratio of cells, where a cell has to have adequate surface area relative to its volume to take in nutrients and get rid of waste products. Well, that applies to multi-celled animals, even on a larger scale. And one of the ways we get larger animals can exist is by having these complicated systems, a respiratory system, a circulatory system that increases the surface area relative to for all the cells relative to the animal's volume. So that's why a respiratory system works very well with a circulatory system. Alright, the circulatory system of a fish is called a single circuit because the blood passes through the heart of the fish once in each turn around the body. Now, single circuit works well for a fish but would not work for a tetrapod. That would not work. We would not, because for one thing, the pressure is much too low to move the blood through the capillaries of the lungs and then through the rest of the body. It don't work that way because terrestrial vertebrates have very higher metabolic demands. So, land vertebrates have double circulation, in which the blood is pumped a second time after it passes through the lungs, and it goes back to the heart and gets pumped through the rest of the body. So it's a double circuit. The pulmonary circuit carries the blood between the heart and the lungs. The systemic circuit carries blood between the heart and the rest of the body and then back to the heart. All right. This is the double circulation pattern for a toad or a frog, where blood returns to the right side of the heart, then is pumped to the capillaries of the lung and the skin, because frogs also breathe with their skin. And then picking up oxygen, this blood returns from the skin and lungs back to the left side of the heart and then through the rest of the body, the systemic capillaries. These fish, frogs, and other amphibians, and most reptiles, is a three-chambered heart, where the right atrium receives the blood returning from the systemic capillaries. And then the ventricle, one ventricle, pumps the blood to the lungs and skin, because gas exchange takes place in the lungs and in the skin. We call this a pulmocutaneous circuit. Now, in a three-chambered heart, blood from the two atria will mix, but the heart has a structure, a ridge, which will divert most of the oxygen-poor blood to the pulmocutaneous circuit and the oxygen-rich blood to the systemic circuit. Now, in turtles, snakes, and lizards, the ventricle is actually better divided, and less mixing of blood, oxygen-poor and oxygen-rich blood occurs in these. And in crocodilians, they actually have a four-chambered heart, a complete separation of the pulmonary and systemic circuits. In birds and mammals, the heart has four chambers, two atria and 2 ventricles. The right side of the heart handles only oxygen-poor blood. The left side only handles oxygen-rich blood. And this is the circulatory system found in people and birds. Complete separation of the pulmonary circuit and the systemic circuit. There is a ridge. There is a septum, a muscular septum which separates the 2 pumping ventricles. Blood flow through the double circulatory system of a human. Let's look at, and not just humans, but all mammals have this similar. The blood drains from a superior vena cava. That's a vein, major vein, which drains the head and arms. And there's another major vein called the inferior vena cava, which drains the legs and the lower part of the body, abdominal cavity, into the right atrium, the right receiving chamber. Then this blood flows into the right ventricle and is pushed via the pulmonary arteries. There's a set to each lung where the blood is oxygenated. And then the blood returns by means of pulmonary veins back to the left atrium, then to the left ventricle. Then it's pushed out into the aorta, which is the major artery of the body. Essentially, the heart is 2 pumps. The right side propels blood through the pulmonary circulation. The left side propels blood through the systemic circuit. The left ventricle is actually larger and has a thicker muscular wall than the right ventricle.
In mammals, blood pumped by the right side of the heart passes through the lungs and enters the left side of the heart. This is the pulmonary circuit. Blood pumped by the left side of the heart is distributed to the other body organs and returns to the right side of the heart. This is the systemic circuit. This pattern, called double circulation, ensures vigorous blood flow to the organs because the heart pumps the blood a second time after it returns from the lungs.
In this diagram here, this illustrates both the pulmonary circulation and systemic circulation of the typical vertebrate, in this case, humans. All right, so let's take a look at what we're looking at here is systemic circulation. Here, blood from the left side of the heart is pushed from the left ventricle into the aorta, which splits into a trunk leading to the arms and head. And then this blood returns by means of the superior vena cava back to the right atrium. Now, the rest of the blood goes down to the abdominal cavity and legs and returns back by means of the inferior vena cava back to the right atrium. In pulmonary circulation, oxygen-poor blood entering the right ventricle moves into the right atrium, moving into the right ventricle, gets pushed into the pulmonary trunk, which branches into 2 pulmonary arteries, 1 to each lung. In the pulmonary capillaries, oxygen exchange takes place. The oxygen-poor blood becomes oxygen-rich, returns back to the left side of the heart. Pulmonary veins, there's 2 from each lung, connects to the left atrium. Then the oxygen-rich blood moves to the left ventricle, and the cycle repeats itself. And you put them both together. Go ahead and make a fist. That's about the size of your heart right there. It's enclosed in a membranous sac called a pericardium sac. It's right underneath your sternum, and it's made up mostly of cardiac muscle. The heart separately, but at the same time, pumps blood to the lungs and back and to the rest of the body and back. Two separate pumps, but they work together at the same time. Also located in the heart are 4 valves, which help keep the blood flowing in one direction and one direction only. The purpose of the valves in the heart prevent backflow, which you don't want. Now, there's a set of valves between each atrium and each ventricle. These are called atrioventricular valves. They're located between each atrium and each ventricle. There's one on the right side called the right AV valve, one on the left side. Now, when blood leaves a ventricle, either on the right side or the left side, it has to pass through a semilunar valve. The one on the right side is the pulmonary semilunar valve. One on the left side is the aortic semilunar valve. Now, a heartbeat consists of a contraction and relaxation sequence. We call this the cardiac cycle. Cycle has 2 main phases. When the heart is relaxed, that's called diastole. During diastole, blood flows into heart chambers. During the contraction phase, called systole, the blood flows from the atria into ventricles, and then from ventricles outside of the heart. Alright, in diastole, the heart is relaxed. The AV valves are open, semilunar valves are closed. In the second part, systole, first the atria contract. When the atria contract, pushing the blood through into the ventricles. Next, the ventricles contract. When the ventricles contract, the AV valves are closed. They close, but the semilunar valves open because of the increased pressure in the ventricles. That increased pressure, number 1, closes the AV valves, but opens the semilunar valves. And then blood will flow through each circuit. Now, the heart does this on average 72 times a minute. So cardiac output is a term that refers to the volume of blood that each ventricle pumps per minute. And heart rate's number of heartbeats per minute. Now, there is a structure called an SA node, and it sets the tempo of the heartbeat. The SA node generates the electrical impulses in the atria, which sets the rate of electrical contractions. These electrical impulses are received by the atrioventricular node, which sends the signals to the ventricles, and that triggers the ventricles to contract. The SA node is called the cardiac pacemaker. So, number 1, the cardiac pacemaker fires, sending a message. Number 2, the AV node receives that message, sending the impulses through these bundles into Purkinje fibers embedded in the ventricular walls. And number 3, when the impulses reaches down here, it triggers ventricular contraction. Number 4, the ventricles have contracted. Now, an electrocardiogram, they measure the electrical impulse of the heart, and it tells them something how the heart's functioning. And there are certain types of heart disease where the pacemaker does not work properly. And what doctors can do, implant an artificial pacemaker which will emit the electrical signals which keeps the heart rate normal. Now, your heart muscle cells require nutrients and oxygen to survive. Now, the way that the heart has its own circulatory pathway. When blood leaves the aorta, it branches into a coronary arteries. There are several coronary arteries which supply all the heart muscle they branch off this main coronary artery and they feed blood to all the heart muscle. Now, a heart attack is when cardiac, due to a blockage of a coronary artery, part of the heart does not receive circulation or oxygen, and it causes death or destruction to that heart muscle. And heart disease will kill you if nothing else will. Now, a stroke happens in the brain. A stroke is similar to a heart attack, except it's a blockage in the brain, and it does the same thing. Now, what causes this blockage of arteries? It's a progressive condition called atherosclerosis, where fatty deposits block in the inner walls of the arteries, restricts blood flow. If it happens in the coronary arteries, you're going to have a heart attack. If it happens in the cerebral arteries, you're going to have a stroke. This is a normal artery. That's a blocked one, called atherosclerosis. All right. Structure and function of blood vessels. Capillaries consist of very thin walls, just a single layer of epithelial cells, nothing else. Capillaries are very narrow. They're about as wide as one red blood cell. And they exchange gases and fluids. They are leaky. They exchange gases and fluids with interstitial fluid. This is a capillary. When the blood vessels line up single file, that's how you know that's a capillary. And as the blood moves through the capillary, nutrients, there is exchanges between the blood and the tissues by way of the interstitial fluid. So nutrients and oxygen diffuse into the tissue, same time waste products and CO2 diffuse into the capillary. Now, arteries and veins are also lined by a single layer epithelial cells, but then that's covered with elastic fibers in outer connective tissue. It allows these vessels they can recoil and stretch. Arteries have a very thick, smooth muscle wall, and they can actually constrict their walls, make them smaller or make them larger. And they can reduce blood flow to parts of the body. Veins have much thinner layer of smooth muscle, and veins can have a larger space, a lumen inside of them. They serve as a reservoir of sorts. Veins also have valves, a system of one-way valves which prevent backflow of blood, especially the veins in your legs. So, arteries consist of a single layer of epithelium surrounded by smooth muscle and connective tissue. Arteries have very thicker walls. Veins have thinner smooth muscle walls, but other than that, their structure is similar, but veins also have the one-way valves. Blood pressure is the force of blood as it pushes against the blood vessel walls. It's the push of the blood. Blood pressure varies. It depends on the cardiac output and whether or not the arteries are constricted or relaxed. And as the blood moves away from the heart, further away it gets, blood pressure drops off to where it's almost non-existent in veins and capillaries. So, blood pressure is measured systolic. That's the pressure when the heart's contracting. Diastolic is when the heart's relaxed. Blood pressure is highest in the aorta, but as the aorta branches in the arteries and arterioles, leading to capillaries, it diminishes, then picks up. But the blood pressure is less in veins and in arteries. As I said, blood pressure is highest in arteries and lowest in veins. Blood pressure is measured as systolic and diastolic pressures. Systolic pressure is caused by ventricular contraction. Diastolic when the ventricles are relaxed. Alright, here's another question. How does blood travel against gravity, especially in the legs? Well, when you walk, your muscles contract, and they squeeze the veins and push the blood up towards the heart. And then you have the one-way valves, which limit backflow. Typical blood pressure is said to be 120/70. The device is called sphygmomanometer, manometer, whatever. Hypertension is defined as high blood pressure, which can cause serious problems when persistent above 140/90. Your typical blood pressure is 120/70. That's a good pressure to have. Alright, how do they take a blood pressure? Well, they put that cuff on, then they inflate it, and then it squeezes. Well, they pump in enough air in there to close that artery off. That artery is the brachial artery in your upper arm. Next, they put the stethoscope on your arm so they can listen for blood flow through that artery, then they release the air. And then they listen. When they start hearing a thump, 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 the first thump, they look at the manometer, and that's your systolic pressure. Then they release the air gradually, and they start hearing that thump, thump. Then it starts getting dimmer. And at the point they hear the last thump, and followed by a swoosh, they take that pressure again. That's your diastolic. Then they're done. Now, why should you worry about hypertension? Well, makes your heart work harder, it can weaken it, can blow out the blood vessels in your kidneys, it can cause kidney failure, increase rupturing blood vessels, can cause plaque formation and blood clots. And yes, hypertension can lead to a heart attack, stroke, like I said, kidney failure. Now, the arterioles have the smooth muscle can influence blood pressure by constricting and relaxation. Now, the capillaries have little valves called precapillary sphincters where the arterioles join the capillaries. And by opening and closing these sphincters, we can restrict or increase blood flow to different parts of the body. And if these capillaries are closed, the blood will just go directly this way to the venule, to a structure called a thoroughfare channel. But when they relax, the blood will pass through the bed, the network. And this diagram illustrates how blood flow through capillary beds is controlled by precapillary sphincters, tiny little bands of smooth muscle. When the sphincters are relaxed, blood flows through the capillary bed. When they close, blood is bypassed through this thoroughfare channel, so it goes directly from an arteriole here to a venule. Again, when they're open, blood is allowed to pass through the capillary bed entirely. When it's closed, blood flow is restricted strictly to the thoroughfare channel. Alright, let's talk a little bit more about capillaries. They're only a single cell layer thick, no connective tissue, nothing else. So they have very thin walls, and substances and they're very leaky. Interstitial fluid that leaks out of the capillaries becomes an interstitial fluid. Materials leave by diffusion, vesicles, endocytosis, exocytosis, and pressure. Pressure, actually, they're leaky. There's little gaps between the cells, and pressure can actually push liquid out through those clefts. So interstitial fluid, capillary wall, lumen. Alright, blood pressure will force the fluid out at the arterial end, and osmotic pressure, differences in solute concentrations between the interstitial fluid and the blood through the capillary, will draw the fluid back in at the venous end or the venule end. And some of this lost fluid is picked up by lymphatic capillaries by way of the lymphatic system. And this diagram illustrates the movement of fluid out of a capillary into a lymph vessel. Lymphatic vessels are closed at the one end, and substances enter by diffusion. Alright, let's talk about the structure and function of blood and wrap this up. Blood is a fluid connective tissue, extracellular matrix, plasma, and several different types of cells. Plasma is mostly water and dissolved ions, proteins, sugars, buffers. So the plasma makes up 55% of the blood, which is mostly water, salts, buffers, proteins, nutrients, gases, waste products, hormones. Two groups of cells, red blood cells or erythrocytes, transport oxygen. White blood cells, leukocytes, fight infection. And there's variations of about 5 different types of leukocytes. Phagocytes, which eat bacteria, and platelets or thrombocytes, cellular fragments, which play a big role in blood clotting. Red blood cells contain hemoglobin, the oxygen transport protein, and nearly most of the cells are red blood cells. White blood cells are called leukocytes, which function in defense and immunity. Their numbers are much smaller. There's not as many of them. And it's the basophils and the monocytes that are phagocytes. They actually eat bacteria and viruses and other things. Alright, you have a lot of red blood cells. You need a substantial amount. Not having enough, you don't get enough oxygen, but too many red blood cells can make your blood thick, like motor oil, and that can cause all kinds of problems. Red blood cells are replaced about every 3 months. They last about 120 days. The liver is responsible for the remains of the red blood cell. The iron is removed and recycled. Anemia is not enough red blood cells or not enough hemoglobin inside those blood cells, and that causes fatigue. There is a hormone produced by your kidneys called erythropoietin, and it stimulates the kidneys, the bone marrow I mean, to produce more red blood cells. Now, some athletes do something called blood doping, and they can also inject this hormone synthetically. And yes, it can lead to clotting, stroke, death. When a blood vessel is damaged, such as a capillary, for example, the platelets will adhere to the exposed ends of the wound, and then they release chemicals that cause them to stick together, and then clotting factors in the blood set off a chain of reactions that form a scab. There's a protein enzyme that converts a protein, fibrinogen, which is in the end, forms fibrin. Alright, let's say there's a rupture in the capillary wall. platelets attached to the cut ends, forming a sticky plug. And then threads of fibrin weave their way around the platelets. That's what it looks like. Red marrow. There's two types of bone marrow, red marrow and yellow marrow. Your marrow stores fat. Red marrow contains stem cells which produce blood cells. When stem cells divide, one daughter cell remains a stem cell, but the other cell will differentiate into something. In the bone marrow, there's two types of stem cells, lymphoid stem cells and myeloid stem cells. Lymphoid stem cells produce two types of lymphocytes, the B lymphocytes and the T lymphocytes, which are part of your immune system. The myeloid stem cells differentiate into erythrocytes and the other white blood cells, besides the lymphocytes, the other four, and platelets. So, multipotent stem cells, which divide to form the lymphoid and the myeloid. The lymphoid produce the two different types of lymphocytes. The myeloid give rise to everything else. Leukemia is a cancer white blood cell. You have too many white blood cells that do not function and generally will kill you unless you get it treated. There's different treatments. Bone marrow transplant, chemotherapy, radiation. Alright, there's a diagram I wanted you to download and print and label the parts of the circulatory system here. Thank you.